to episode 7 in the series 1 on the journey to conscious healthcare, where we explore what it takes to consciously create longevity, happiness and fulfillment in your life and that of others. The journey to conscious healthcare looks at the healthcare industry, disability sector and how to best navigate these areas to get the best for you and your life. This series is called the Do's and Don'ts of Support Coordination, where we take a look inside of what it takes to be an NDIS support coordinator and help them best navigate the system, which is a constantly changing NDIS. I'm your host, Trevor, and I'm also the founder and CEO of Conscious Healthcare SA, an expert company that is known for high-quality healthcare services and transforming the healthcare industry in the disability space. Today's show is sponsored by Conscious Healthcare SA. At Conscious Healthcare SA, we provide high-quality NDIS healthcare services in the comfort of your own home. If you're interested in an easy and reliable way to navigate the NDIS and access healthcare services, please get in touch. Today's guest has taken somewhat of an unusual approach to becoming a specialist support coordinator, an SSE for those that don't know. She dedicated 31 years of her life working within SA Health as an occupational therapist, so OT. For those listeners who aren't sure, an OT focuses on promoting health and well-being in all areas of life, and within the disability sector, it's kind of like being a jack of all trades. This makes her a perfect fit for a transition as a specialist support coordinator, combining her case management skills and also her knowledge of health to effectively promote the right services for those who need it. Heather Jesshope, welcome and thank you for joining us today from Assured Home Care.
Hi, Trevor. Thanks. It's good to be here.
Perfect. Well, we've got a bit of a personal question, which we always start with. I'm really intrigued for you. What was it that you wanted to do when you grew up? You've obviously changed careers, but I'd love to know.
Well, actually, funnily enough, I actually did want to be an occupational therapist, which is probably a little bit boring, but I was about 11 when I actually had a dislocated hip and ended up in the Women's and Children's Hospital for a whole month. And during that time, had some exposure to the occupational therapist there. Now, I don't think I've probably had any understanding what OT was or what they did, but I decided from that day on that I wanted to be an OT, and I never changed my mind.
Wow, that's amazing. And was it how it made you feel? You didn't know what the job particularly was and what the ins and outs of it were, but was it how you felt when you were seeing that person?
I guess it felt like it was purposeful and that it was helping other people, and that's always something that's been a big thing for me, is that I just really love people and want to connect with people and help make their lives a little bit better. So, yeah.
That's a fantastic, very loving, caring, generous in nature as far as helping people. I think it's a bit of an interesting one in the disability space, particularly as support coordinators. I would say that there's just a profound love for wanting to help people. I don't know if you see it differently.
Definitely. Yeah, no, I agree. And I mean, you don't do it for the money, do you? Really, look, let's face it. The money. It's good to get paid and to be able to pay the bills at home and that sort of thing. But it's not going to make you rich. You do it for the richness in other ways. Of being able to actually get alongside of people and be able to help them to live their best life. And I know that's kind of a standard line that we hear, but for me, that's what support coordination is about. You do it for the heart of it, not for the other rewards.
No, I think that's really well said. And there's nothing better than actually being able to positively impact someone's life. Speaking of your sort of journey with occupational therapy, so you were inspired to become an occupational therapist from your backstory there. How did that sort of journey go? Let's walk through a little bit of time from the start for you, if that's okay.
Yeah, so I guess I feel like I was really pretty blessed, really, that going through high school and into university, I was accepted into OT sort of straight away, so there wasn't any sort of big delay or anything on that. Then I've done quite a few different things through OT. I've done some work a little bit of work in hospitals, but mostly community-based. So I did a big chunk of time with the old domiciliary care, as it was back in the day. So going out into people's homes, doing assessments of, bathrooms and access at front and back doors and tripping hazards and all those sorts of things that OTs look for. And that was really what I kind of fell in love with, was the community aspect of the work. I think for me, seeing people in their own homes, you learn so much more about them. I'd love walking into someone's house and it would be covered with things that they had made themselves, whether it was a lady who was into china painting or quilting, or I remember going to one particular gentleman's house who had this huge train set out in his sheds, and he'd built all these little villages and houses and bridges and things, and he was just sort of tickled pink to be able to show me his life's work, really. And that's kind of what's really helps push my passion, I guess, is actually being able to see real people who've, even, getting to know someone's dog or their family members from the photos on the wall, and just taking genuine interest in people's lives. I think that really helps you with that rapport building and bonding with a client, as well as to really be able to genuinely and sincerely take an interest in who they are. I think especially as people get a bit older as well, because quite a bit of my work before being a support coordinator was with older people. Everybody forgets that they're all going to get old one day too, and you sort of think, oh, that's just an older person. Well, it might turn out to be an older person who was, a nurse for 60 years and was the matron of a hospital, or it might be a man who, was a missionary in Africa, you just don't know. There's all these incredible stories out there, and, it's very easy for those people to feel overlooked.
I can completely understand that. I'm hearing a lot of things as an OT, passion and purpose, joy. What brings you joy? I feel like that's personified in the OT space. It's really important to look at what gives people joy. I know I've spoken to Tim, one of the OTs that works within our sector at our team, and I constantly talk about having a similar perspective as far as really looking at the holistic and what does give someone joy. It's not just about movement. It's like movement relation to what's important. Is it getting back into tennis, or
exactly
what are the things that give you joy?
OTs talk a lot about meaning as well, doing what's meaningful in your life. And so sometimes in the disability sector as well, I have a client, for example, who goes to a day options program 5 days a week. Now, I think she probably has skills that she could do more with than that. But that program is really super meaningful to her. She almost considers that to be her family and her home. So if that's what is meaningful, then that's what we continue to help her connect with. That having that meaning is super important.
It's a really interesting one there, because I suppose it's almost like the attachment to objects. So an example there being your objects that you own yourself, you find harder to give away than if it was someone else's.
Yeah.
And it's so I suppose that's the adversity to change. I mean, we talk about meaning. Is some of it as well more that's all they know, or is it that's what is meaningful? Because I suppose in the disability space, if we talk about, I was talking to Daisy recently in one of our previous episodes, and when I was talking to her, it's very interesting. She worked at Minda, and when she was working at Minda, she was talking about how gone from the institutionalized model, if we go back, 20 years, say, to now where the NDIS is very much open slather. It's very much about freedom, choice, and control. So is that changed as far as what's meaningful? Are they fully informed? Are participants fully informed to know what is meaningful, where it could go? So I know it's not about us as therapists, but do you get what I'm sort of coming at? It's an interesting conversation.
Yeah, I do. I do get your question. Yeah, and it's a good question. I think it's about digging a little bit deeper, I think, isn't it? So rather than thinking, oh, well, this is what they're doing now, so it must be meaningful to them, so let's just keep going with that. As you say, lots of people are resistant to change, and we are too. I think that's common across the whole population. We don't like change. We like things to stay the same. But for some people, a little bit of change is an important thing. The particular client, actually, we talked about before, we're going to call her Jenny.
Yeah, Jenny, let's go through Jenny.
We're going to talk about because this is actually Jenny that I'm referring to as well. In her case, she's had lots of changes in the last 12 months. So it's a case of having some stability actually is really important, because she's an adult with cerebral palsy, had lived with her mother, but has now moved out of her home in the last 12 months for the first time ever in her life. So that change has been enormous. And suddenly having to, rather than relying on her mum for physical assistance, she's having that from support worker staff and things like that. She's also managing or trying to manage her finances for the first time ever in her life as well, another huge change. And making her own decisions, all of those things. So there's been one change after another. So at the moment, that stability of having that program that she attends and does get a lot of meaning out of is really important. And I wouldn't consider changing that at this stage, because that it would almost be one step too far.
That's a great topic and analogy and way of bringing it up, because I suppose a question, say with support coordinators that come into the role, this isn't across the board, but like people have got different levels of experience. So we've got people who've got tremendous amounts of lived experience. So they've actually got a disability themselves, or they've actually had a family member or something like that. Then you've got allied health professionals who, as you would know, when you go through university, you learn about, the different professions, you learn about social work, developmental education, physio, all that sort of stuff. So my question there, I guess, is, so for support coordinators, is there maybe a tendency, if they haven't had that background or training, to maybe want to make all these changes rather than coming in from that real meaningful approach and sitting in their shoes? Because how do you learn how to do that? Is that something that, as allied health professionals, I'd argue that it might be intrinsic from the way that you've ended up getting trained. But I wonder for support coordinators in general, would they typically know, or they might try and change too many things at once? So I'm really interested.
Yeah. I guess it's interesting because I'm in an assistant manager role these days as well. So I manage a team, and I also have responsibility for recruitment to that team. So at the moment, we actually are recruiting some new staff, none of which have been support coordinators before. But they've come through. So it's a perfect question. So they've come through. Some of them have had sort of support worker experience in the disability sector. Some have had lived experience. One was telling me about a family member who battles with schizophrenia. We recently also had another team member who's, children with autism. So I think lived experience is actually really valuable, really super valuable. And each team of support coordinators, I believe, should have at least one person who's got that lived experience, because it's much more a personal connection than just having the right kind of training is. But one thing I do, because we've started doing some in-house training now as well for our support coordinators, and one thing I recommend to them is when you go out to see a new client, you might come away with this whole list of, I want to do this and I want to do that and I want to do that. And I'll often suggest to them, try and really ask the client, what out of all of those things, what do they want to do first? Because if you try and tackle all of them at once, my hunch is it'll probably fall over and they probably won't end up with many of them at all, because it's just too much. It's too overwhelming. So when it comes to, encouraging your clients to take on supports or therapies, I'd say pick maybe two and let's start there, see how they go. Then we'll review, we can add on to it, we can change it, we can always adapt. But to try and do all of them at once, especially if it's someone, who's been fairly private and reluctant to have people in their home, for example, which is really common at the moment with COVID. A lot of people don't want many people coming through their home, and for good reason. So just start simply. And I think that can really help the client as well to really hone in on what is it that is the most important to them. Because as you said before, it's all about choice and control as well. Our job is not to push or to send them in a particular direction, but to try to facilitate those client choices. So, that's a strategy I recommend a lot, is one step at a time. Let's tackle a couple of things and make headway on those before we tackle the next part of the list.
Yeah, I'm hearing a couple of things in that. Picking your priority, so prioritisation being a big one.
Yep.
That leads in very strongly to expectation management, because you're going, hey, these are the things we're going to tackle. I think it might have been Sian Williams, or it could have been Kate Turnbull, who, when I was talking to her in the podcast, they were very much going through about, balancing expectations, because, funding, timing, availability. You can't always determine as to how long a wait list is going to be, or I mean, we talk about housing and stuff like that. How long that can be to, if it's not in the plans, you can go through the exploring phase. Like, there's so many different aspects to it.
Absolutely. And I think that's a bit of a tendency from clients, but also from other people in the sector, to think that, well, there's a problem with that, the support coordinator will fix it. And so we actually get asked to do things that are not our job at all. It happens fairly regularly, to be honest, like even around the housing issue, for example. I've had support coordinators on my team who've basically been asked to act like a real estate agent and, find someone a rental property and help them sign their lease and things like that. Well, really, that's not really, it's kind of an extension of what we can do as a support coordinator. But, if it starts to be sort of really pressured, timely sort of decisions, one person was like, oh, I'm really cross at my support coordinator because I missed out on that house because they didn't help me sign the lease quick enough. Well, again, that's an unreasonable expectation, I think, of someone working as a support coordinator. Or, another client who's just come out of prison and doesn't have furniture, for example, and all of a sudden, well, the support coordinator will sort that out. Well, it's not really
a blurred line, isn't it? I remember being I don't know if you attended the webinar. I keep plugging him, but Aaron Burns, fantastic. He was talking from the NDIS. He was sort of going through about there's these guidelines that's meant to be released in regards to support coordination. And I'm really interested to see when they come out, because when they come out, I think it's just going to be a lot easier that it's either in the box or not in the box. Now, I know it's not going to be as simple as that, but fundamentally having a guiding framework, I think, will end up guiding things a bit more, because fundamentally you get plans these days, it might be 12 hours, could be 60 hours, depending on how complex it is.
Yeah, exactly.
And if you're going to try and, look for housing and stuff like that, like, normal accommodation, that makes it very challenging, along with linking up services, support workers, and all these other different things, community activities, trying to explore that interest. So challenging space. But further to where we're sort of going before, I'd love to know how you, being an occupational therapist, so an OT, how has that changed or shaped the way that you conduct yourself as a support coordinator? Has it added to the role, or has it, brought up challenges as well? Because there could be pluses and minuses with having had that experience as well. I'd love to know your thoughts.
Yeah. I think being an OT equips you beautifully to be a support coordinator, because we are very holistic, I guess. We, as an OT, you learn about lots of different facets of someone's life, whether it's a physical things or social, psychological, even spiritual as well. And we're good at problem solving. That's one of the other things OTs really focus on, is breaking down an activity, for example, into smaller chunks. So, for example, if someone really wants to go to work, well, going to work is a big task, really. So where does that start? Well, the first part of that is they need to be able to get out of bed without help. So that's one of the things that OTs are good at is sort of breaking down a task into its smaller parts. And I think that is a really good skill for support coordination, because often we get asked to do this big task, like find someone a house. Well, okay, but what does that broken down to the smaller part? What does that mean? Like, do they want to live on their own? Do they want to share? What suburb do they want to be in? Do they want to have a house that's big enough to have a pet? So that skill of breaking something down to its smaller parts, I think, is really helpful. I think the main struggle I've had with it actually has been remembering my boundaries, that I'm not an OT anymore. I can't prescribe equipment. I can't prescribe someone some home modifications. That I think the worst I ever did was actually arrange for a grab rail to be fitted on someone's toilet wall, because I figured I don't really need to get an OT in just to put a grab rail on the wall. But I have several times had to really sort of, tell myself, no, that's OT. Step away, get an actual registered OT back in to do that, because that's the important aspect of it as well, as I am not registered as an OT anymore. So I need to be very careful on a professional level to keep to those boundaries.
I completely understand that. But I think on a flip side, let's unpack this a bit more. Like, so having had your OT experiences, you see all these FCA, so functional capacity evaluation, or FCE, depends on assessment or evaluation, whatever you want to call it. In those assessments, you end up getting typically, would suggest physiotherapy or would suggest different allied health service, social work, whatever it might be. Has that positioned you in a better position to understand those therapies so that then you know, hey, this is what's required? Because this is a conversation that comes up a few times, and we've got a question slightly later, similar, but in regards to, we've got OTs that are at full tilt capacity, right? I mean, at the end of the day, if there's 100 OTs around, they'll get jobs straight away right now. I think that's the reality. So in regards to understanding what's required, so what sort of therapies would be appropriate.
Yeah.
Because you've got that background experience, you'd know that. But then on the flip side as well, knowing, hey, I know an OT could do this, do you then sometimes refer through to a social worker or a developmental educator who you've probably got capacity there, which is still doing a similar task to an OT, but it's getting to the bus stop, but it's just a different route. Yeah. I'm interested in how you might approach that differently to someone else. I feel like you might.
Yeah, I think there's a whole bundle of questions I can see in what you just said. One of them is, I think, having had that OT background, I'm certainly really well positioned to have peer-to-peer discussions with therapists. So I've had several OTs, for example, and again with Jenny, there's been a particular difficulty around toileting, for example. Well, I can come in and sort of go, well, have you thought about this, or have you thought about that, or what about if we tried such and such? And there's an understanding and a respect from the therapist that I know what I'm talking about. Yeah. And so that can be really helpful in that. And sometimes, I've been able to come up with ideas that perhaps had been overlooked and hadn't been thought about before. Another thing, of course, is the NDIS are really strong on evidence. You've got to have good reports coming in and reports that are focused on disability issues, focused on goals, focused on choice and control, and focused away from health issues. So one particular physio, for example, I had a report come in at one stage, and he's very much a physio who just works in a clinic. He's not really out and about in the community. He's more your traditional physio who's doing some manipulation and some ultrasound and various treatments and things, but he's not really very well connected in the NDIS space. So he had sent me a report for a different client, and I basically sort of said to him, look, please don't be offended, but would you mind if I actually give you some really serious critique of your report? Yeah. Because it's actually what you've written here is not going to help. Because it was talking about pain, it was talking about things to do with health conditions and really coming from the perspective of treatment, which is a bit of a dirty word in the NDIS these days. We can't be seen to be funding treatment. So, really going on the front foot, I guess, and being proactive about that and saying, look, you need in your report, you must include their NDIS goals. You must talk about their day-to-day functioning, how it impacts their disability rather than their health. Yeah. So, some of those sorts of things to really try and improve the quality of the evidence that's going to the NDIS for our clients, because in the end, that's what's going to help, with the calculation of funding and things like that. So I think that's another thing that I've definitely, been quite upfront with people about. And even, I had a OT report from someone I know quite well the other day for another client, and I said, look, can we change it here and here and here? And she's happy to come back with revisions. So having input into that, I think, having the OT background is really, really super important.
Yeah, I'm hearing a couple really good messages that are coming out of that. I mean, we get all our reports proof in regards to, doesn't matter whether it's physio, social work, OT, everyone's got to get their reports proofed. I think that's absolutely pivotal. And having that experience, if you haven't had the experience in the NDIS, I mean, we've got all these other different funding streams. You could be returned to work. You might be working in aged care. The NDIS is its own sector. So you can't really be naive enough to just go out and, walk out the door. And just because you're qualified as a therapist in private practice doesn't mean that those skills transition across. And it made me think as well, I gave a presentation at Calvary a while ago at the hospital, and the understanding of the difference between disability and just what's normal, and then what's the impact of the disability, and then bridging the gap. I can't remember the names I used in it, but long story short is that wording is so important. Like the NDIS doesn't care about pain, but they will care about someone who's got a neurological disability that then ends up hindering them, and by hindering them, that ends up having the pain and all that might be in there, but fundamentally it's the function.
Correct.
You've got to be talking about the function.
Absolutely.
If we're not talking about those things,
Absolutely.
you're wasting your money on your reports and you're not going to get the outcomes.
Absolutely, exactly. And I think that's a frustration as well with the NDIS. OT, physio, social work, we're all trained to be holistic in the way we look at a client and their life. The NDIS is far from holistic. They care about this, and everything that relates to this is their problem. Everything else is not. It does your head in a little bit, trying to change that focus. And of course, on the day-to-day level, we still want to treat a client holistically because it's super important. Every aspect of that person's life is important to them. But it is a big challenge with the NDIS, especially for clients who are wanting extra physio or exercise physiology, whatever it is, to assist with their health issues and in particular with their pain, and trying to explain to them, what the NDIS will fund and what they won't fund is a huge challenge for support coordinators because, on top of it, if the person might have an intellectual disability as well, or a mental health concern, or, just a simplistic outlook on life, I guess, even. And so they don't get it. I need this input. I need this service and this treatment. Why won't the NDIS pay for it? Big challenge.
Well, it sounds like a good opportunity. We've got a future podcast lined up to interview someone from the agency, so the NDIS or NDIA, however you want to speak to it. So we're going to get a high-profile person up. So support coordinators that are out there listening, I think great opportunity to flick in some messages and get them answered. I think we're really talking about reasonable or necessary, which is what we want to unpack. We probably want to unpack, support coordinators. What do they do? What do they not do? What's in scope? What's out of scope? Those sorts of things. And probably the lingo, the language. How do you actually write reports that matter, reports that get an impact? I mean, we've got pretty good at honing that over a while, and I'm sure you have because of your extensive experience. But it's something that we need to educate the sector and make sure that everyone catches up, because otherwise the participants are the ones that miss out, I think.
Yeah, that's right. Because, some people are sort of like, well, my report's fine. What's the problem with it? Well, yeah, okay, it's fine, but it's not going to achieve anything. It's actually not going to carry any weight of evidence. Yeah. So, which is
tremendously frustrating. Also, whilst we talk about frustrations, I think it's frustrating waiting to get services. I don't know about you. It's not much fun when we talk about wait lists of 6 or 9 months. So I'm interested. I sort of asked a little bit before, but I think can we create capacity? Like as an example, we're getting a little bit too channeled in, a little bit of blinkers on, the horses riding down the street. Are we sort of getting a bit too blinkers on? OTs need to do everything. I mean, is there capacity that we can create in other means, such as social workers that have got mental health experience, developmental educators? In pediatrics, as an example, you've got physiotherapists, OTs and speech pathologists all work really closely together. Is there an opportunity for us to create capacity which isn't there? I dare say you would identify it, but I'm not sure across the board how well that's going.
The NDIS has been fantastic for the profession of OT, I would have to say. I think there's more OT jobs now than there ever have been in the history of disability and healthcare in Australia. It's a challenge, though, because DE actually is a little bit the same. Like DEs tend to get really caught up into the positive behaviour support plans and doing, restrictive practice and all that sort of stuff around behaviour, because I think there's a lot more that DEs could offer as well around helping people have a little bit more structure around their weekly routine and things like that. How are they going to cope with different learning and, all that sort of educational side of what a DE can offer. And it's really hard to get DEs for that purpose as well. So I sort of hear what you're saying. I think social work is probably one of the most undervalued professions within disability. And several times recently, situations have come up within my team and I've said, look, really, that person needs a social worker. This is someone who's, in a domestic violence situation, for example, which unfortunately is all too common in the disability field.
Yeah, absolutely.
If they need that support and trying to find women's shelters and resources that are going to cope with their disability as well as with the fact that they can't go home, that's more of a social worker issue, refer to a social worker. I think, the NDIS for a while has been very OT-centric, which, as I say, is good for OTs, but it is becoming an issue with having enough therapists to go round, for sure. I can't think of a particular example where I have sort of used someone other than an OT for a situation. However, with my client Jenny, we had started down a psychology track with her and trying to get some psychology input around some understanding and coping with change. The psychologist has finished and that's switched over to a DE because the DE can take more of a really practical, hands-on kind of approach with it more than a psychologist would.
I think that's a good point that you raised there. I mean, it might sound a bit offensive to psychologists, but DEs sometimes are referred to, developmental educators, as practical psychologists as far as practically implementing. It's actually the behaviour change and it's actually seeing it in the environment. We're not talking about psychology in a clinic, which is what typically happens. Yeah. And we know that there's not enough capacity in that regard as well.
And sometimes I think the DE can by approaching it from a behaviour change kind of perspective, they can actually, for some people, achieve more than a psychologist can. Some people that don't want to talk about their deep and meaningful feelings, but if you can approach it from the way you're coming across with your workers, for example, you're sounding a bit angry. So how can we deal with things so that you and your support workers are getting on better, which is more the way that a DE would approach it.
Yeah, which sort of breaks down a few of the barriers there. I think you raised some really good points as far as going back to the social work thing. So Patricia, who's the president from the AASW, so she works in the AASW, is the peak body for social work. I had a conversation with her a while ago and talking about where social work's sort of going, and I'm really intrigued to see how all these different professionals going to open up and how we're going to meet the demand that's there. The next series that we're running is actually interviewing all the presidents around all the different peak bodies. So whether the Australian Physiotherapy Association, we've just had Scott Willis, and we've got a few others that are coming in. And I think it'd be really insightful to be able to learn about what those different professionals are and what they do. Really looking forward to having everyone on the same page.
I
think that'd be a massive sort of win, because I think it'll open up doors. I mean, you've just said before your approach that, hey, I can use a DE from a psych, whereas others might not have that information yet. And it's becoming probably more mainstream, but I think we need to keep educating.
Yeah, definitely. And things like, I mentioned before about people coming out of prison. So that's something that our company has done a bit of, is helping people that transition. They've been in Yatala or wherever it might be, and they're about to be released, but because of their disability, they have particular needs as well. I think that's the kind of time that having a social worker on board could be really invaluable to help that person, establish themselves in a local community, work out where the local networks are that they can get connected with and things like that. Because, often at that point of leaving prison, the person has very, very little in the way of belongings or furniture, and they're very disconnected. There's often been a problem. It may have even been the family member who was, the victim of their crime. So, often they're very fractured from any kind of community. So that's one particular example where I think social work could really, really be beneficial.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, because I know, I think it's yourself, so Assured Home Care, and also Oars do quite a lot of work with prisons.
Yeah, they do.
I'm quite intrigued in regards to working with the prisons, because you quite often will go quite remote, so rural with that as well, from memory.
Yeah, we have rural clients. Yeah, and we're just actually appointing someone who lives in Whyalla, which is going to be quite exciting. So, we have clients in Whyalla, Port Augusta and Port Pirie, and they're often come through the justice system. There quite a few of them are Indigenous as well, which also is exciting and challenging as well. So, there's quite a few different things that we sort of develop a bit of a specialty in, I guess, and hoping that that's going to grow.
Well, I think that's a really good point, and it is a bit of a point of difference that you do have there, going out rural. As far as services and getting access to services, how do you find that is? Because I'm really interested
Really
in two things. So access to services, but also what about telehealth? We're in COVID time, so we need to be up with the latest, and I think we need to be adapting towards the future, because maybe, like, as in, if therapists can help work via telehealth and stuff like that, they can end up working with support workers and stuff like that as well to then maximize funding a bit more, or family members, whatever it might be. So how are you going with capacity, and also capacity for allied health or services around, I guess, could all rural on that as well, and then also telehealth adoption?
Yeah. You've absolutely hit the nail on the head. Getting service providers, regionally is very difficult. And even things like transport issues, there's, I think, maybe 2 access cabs in Whyalla, and that's it, And I don't know that if there's any in Port Augusta, I'm not sure. They're complex issues for sure. Telehealth, in my experience, for people with disabilities, is not as effective as you might think. A lot of people don't really transfer well from a telehealth sort of perspective. And that might be because, they might have vision issues. They might just have issues, sensory kind of autism type things where they struggle with that. It's not been the big win that I thought it might be, that using telehealth would be a really good solution.
Are we ahead of our time possibly there, though? I question. I mean,
maybe.
I hear what you're saying, but I remember when we was talking to Scott Willis, he was working with colleagues at the APA, and they were talking to private health insurers about, if you think about, if you've got private health insurance, they were talking about telehealth about 5 or 6, 7 years ago, and they got laughed out the office pretty much. And it's really interesting now, it's mainstream. So I wonder whether that's just that change we were talking about earlier, and that slow adaptation, and whether it will move there. It's just not quite there yet.
Ask me again in 6 months, and it'll be really interesting to see how it's gone, because we literally have someone starting next week who's going to be working regionally. And there might, given that she will also have things like a laptop, there might be some opportunity even for her to attend a client's home to just get the telehealth program up and running, and to help them build confidence with it and that sort of thing. So I think, watch this space, basically.
It's exciting.
Just not quite there yet. It is exciting. Yeah, definitely.
Well, so what about services? Have you got a particular biggest shortage that you're unable to get? I mean, OT probably naturally be probably the one that you struggle to get to. But I mean, rurally, is it just, you said no services, and even locally, do you find that there are particular services that are hard to get a hold of?
Certainly in the Indigenous sector, it can be very challenging to find workers that, there's a focus, I guess, on trying to go back to their own community, their own language and things like that. So that can be a massive challenge, trying to find someone who they can relate to. And in particular, we'd had a situation not that long ago where one of our participants were needed to attend a funeral that was going to be up in one of the communities. And, how were we going to actually manage that? How were we going to have someone who could go with him, and that would be appropriate and not, intruding, or, all sorts of
cultural sensitivities
that come with that. Yeah. I think hopefully if we can get our service and our client base to grow a little bit more regionally, will also really help, because with numbers there comes a bigger efficiencies and things like that. So, but no, it's hard work. It really is hard trying to get services to commit to going regionally and supporting those people. It's really difficult.
What if we throw out a wand, a bit of a real life magic stroke, if we could? What if the NDIS had a website that was live updated with, capacity and all that sort of stuff? So we really, it's like having a map and putting a light on there saying, hey, there's real need here. So then people go that way. I mean, if you think of how businesses run, typically they open up a market and a gap and people go in. How great would that be for support coordinators, rather than having to call around all the time and say, you contact 10 people only to find out, hey, they want to go with this one, but there's no capacity now. Challenging. But speaking of challenges, is there any particular challenges? We spoke about it briefly before, but so challenges with the NDIS and how you tackle them. I know you've sort of flagged a couple.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one you hit on earlier is waiting times. Waiting for NDIS responses is a big issue, and people getting really frustrated that they're waiting for approvals for equipment or even waiting for plan reviews, waiting for housing approvals, in particular for SDA and SIL. I think some people are waiting, months to get approvals for SILs. And, what are they supposed to do in the meantime?
Yeah. Or suitability. I mean, even suitability as well, like as in you can find accommodation, but if you're going to have multiple people in the house, you really want that to be a good match.
Exactly.
Found that for a close person within my sphere as well that's sort of having issues in that space.
And, I think the NDIS constantly changing, moving the goalposts as well. At one stage, they seem to be really encouraging people to go for, some of the apartment type complexes like U City that's in Adelaide, and there's one at Bowden as well. And yet then months later they turn around and say they don't want to fund SIL packages for people to live alone. Well, you've created this marketplace, but now you're saying, oh, well, sorry. It's just really, it's just really challenging. I think one of the other big elephants in the room is communicating with the NDIS. We basically have a call centre and one email that we're supposed to use for everything. And so often you'll ring the call centre to inquire about a ROAD request, for example, and they say, oh, we never received it. And I said, well, yeah, you did, because I sent it on this date at this time. I've got the email record there. Look a bit harder, you'll find it. And sure enough, they'll come back, oh, yeah, sorry, we've found it. And it's kind of feels like everything's a bit of a delaying tactic. If they can delay it long enough, they'll save a bit of money and feel a bit better when they have to report back to governments on their overspend and all that sort of thing. It's like...
Well, it's a very interesting topic you raise. I mean, we talk about the spending and that. I mean, how practical would it be if you actually got things done right at the start? You think of the increased capacity. I see this a few times, quite a lot actually. I've seen participants not get the therapies maybe that what they need, and then what ends up happening is they end up having massive core budgets for support workers because they then become physically unable. So their independence goes down. As the independence goes down, you end up finding you're spending, we're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars year in, year out on support working in core. I'm not against that at all. Like, as in, if it's appropriate, absolutely. But where there's a situation someone can increase capacity, why wouldn't we be doing that?
Yeah,
I mean, that's why they talk about early intervention and all that sort of stuff. But you think of post-stroke, post-acquired brain injury, things like that. It's really important that we get on top of this, because not only that, it's the quality of life. What's that quality of life like for someone who's just had that sort of trauma go on? We really want to get them back to having meaningful existence and being able to interact with the community. So really challenging.
Yeah. And then, the whole, they can ring us anytime they like, but we can't ring them. Just that day-to-day challenge, and then they'll say, oh, I've been trying to ring you for days. And well, I was busy. I've been trying to ring you for months, It'd
be nice if we could just book it in straight away. Well, on a flip side from challenging things, let's get a little bit more positive. So they talk about people getting the keys to the city. How about we get the keys to unlocking what we need for the support coordination box? What are golden elements that are required for good support coordinators?
Caring for people with disabilities would be one of the first things, and that passion. You need to be passionate about people with disabilities, but also good communicators. Often, when someone has a disability, they don't communicate necessarily in the same way as everybody else does. So you've got to be flexible and you've got to be clear in your speech. Try and keep it a bit simple, not use super long words and things like that are just going to go straight over their heads. I think you've got to be very flexible and go with the flow. One thing I think that can happen quite a bit with support coordination is you kind of get bombarded by a lot of things all at once. So you might have, Fred's called and Mary's called and Harry's sent you an email and Brian's in a crisis and you've got to, so, you're prioritising, your time management is really important. And being able sometimes to sort of say, well, actually, hang on, no, I can't do that today, or sorry, no, that's actually not my role. So I think you've got to be quite clear about your limits and your boundaries, but also, accommodate that kind of busy juggling kind of situation as much as you can. I've certainly had some of my team actually really struggle with that element of it, that you can end up with all sorts of things going on at the same time, and, trying to actually keep that, together and documented as well, because we have pressure to achieve a certain level of billable hours, which is pretty common across the sector. I think most employers expect about 5 billable hours per workday. It's pretty standard as far as I understand. Now, to do that, you have to be able to show that you've spent that time. And so you've got to keep really good records. You've got to keep really clear documentation so that you can go back when you finally hear from the NDIS 2 or 3 months later. You can go back and see exactly what happened, back then, because you can't keep it all in your head either.
No, I wouldn't suggest. I think relying on good systems, from what I've heard from a lot of support coordinators, has been
definitely
a really good way to approach that. I suppose as we sort of move into some of those stresses, so how would you suggest that support coordinators handle the stresses and constant obstacles thrown their way? Is there any particular sort of, you talk about traits there, you're talking about a lot of different things, prioritization. How do you practically go about it? How do you apply it? How can we get better at this now?
I think, to me, being part of a team is really super important. Getting support from your team, bouncing ideas off of your team. So, for example, in my team, we actually use Microsoft Teams quite a bit. So we'll chat with each other, who knows of a, mental health provider in Elizabeth area who's got availability straight away, or, even what do you think I should do about this situation? So keeping in communication regularly with the team. Now, I guess if you're a sole support coordinator, that makes it, a big challenge. So you need to find someone who can be that bounce off ear that you can brainstorm with and things like that. I think self-care is really, really important, is to sort of reflect on how you're doing, keep an eye on how you're tracking, and to make sure that you actually stop work at the end of the day. I think working from home is all very well, but it's very easy for 5 o'clock to turn into 7 o'clock. I really believe that work is work and home is home. And you need at the end of the day to be able to turn your laptop off, turn your phone off, and walk away, because then you're going to be ready and prepared to face the next day. And if you can't do that, that's, it will gradually build up and up until, you're a bit like a pressure cooker that's about to explode, and that's no good for anybody.
No, I completely agree there. Yeah, so really important as we're sort of talking about those stresses and how to handle it. I think there's really good practical approaches you've got in there, and that sort of teamwork you're saying earlier, crucial to be able to make that
happen. Sometimes I think too, like some clients, let's face it, can be exhausting. We have some clients who ring every day, and it's the same old situations that we can't necessarily resolve, but they can get really overly attached as well to us. So I think it's also important to really consider, has it reached that point, and is it time actually to recommend that they change? I think that over reliance on one particular personality in time can be quite negative. And so I think it's really important to sort of talk through with the client that, I feel as though our relationship has reached a point where it's not helpful anymore, and I think maybe we need to cut our losses, and I think you need a change, kind of thing.
Would that be a change internally? I'm curious, because Daisy was mentioning this in the last podcast. You're saying really important that, what if you had 2 people that actually knew what was happening with, let's call it Jane? Because what happens, you don't plan your annual leave around every participant's plan review. I mean, maybe if you're a sole business, maybe you would, I don't know. But like fundamentally, you talk about the balance between work and life, as in it's a really good mix. I think it's important that maybe you do collaborate like that, have 2 people understand what's happening.
Yeah. I mean, I've got actually Jenny at the moment, I'm needing to pass off to a new support coordinator just because I don't have the time available to give her the time that she needs. So I'm going to sit down and have a discussion with her about that. Does she want to stay within our organisation and go with somebody new, or would she rather have a complete change and go elsewhere? And again, that comes back to client choice and control. And I think part of our role to sort of guide people in that. It's not influencing them necessarily, but making sure they have genuine, honest choice rather than perceived choice, if you know what I mean.
I hear what you're saying. I think that there's a lot of merit in what you're saying there, actually, just having someone being informed, because fundamentally, if you only know about one of 10 options, you're not actually informed. You need to know about those options, and then from there you can make a decision.
Yeah. And, you might put to them, well, the advantage of perhaps staying with our company is that all your history and your records sit with us, and so the new person will be able to access all of that. But then I guess, the advantage of going somewhere else is you've got a fresh start. So, it could go either way. Yeah.
Well, so you talked about getting informed, having issues with capacity, people getting in touch. How should providers best inform support coordinators that they have got capacity, or where do support coordinators go to look for? You talked about communicating within team, but how do you find out about it? Because it's a constantly changing thing day to day.
We get a lot of emails come to our team, at least probably half a dozen a day, talking about, introducing new programs, talking about capacity, that it's a 3-week wait for a speech pathologist, a 4-week wait for an OT, that sort of thing. And so we keep a lot of that sort of stuff on hand and circulate within the team. It is really, it's very challenging because it changes all the time, and it can be quite specific to an area. So, if you want someone in the hills, for example, that can be, a separate challenge to looking for someone down at Seaford or something, or, Semaphore. I've had struggles with at times getting people to go to Semaphore. So, it's variable. So I guess that's why we keep in touch as a team a lot. And that does mean probably there's a tendency to go with organisations that we've worked with before as well and that we trust. Like you guys, we've used your services quite a bit for, your OTs and speeches and whatever. We're also, I guess, we want to know that our clients are going to get good quality support. So, that's, I guess, where it's a bit tricky. If you're the new therapist on the block, it could be hard to sort of establish that reputation. But we do within our company as well. We keep sort of like a spreadsheet of service providers and keep in their details what, the latest thing is about waiting times and things like that. Try to keep that up to date. But that's a big job in itself, really, trying to keep current. Yeah.
I'd love to see the agency potentially take that on as something that they actually end up keeping a list. And it's sort of, if you're going to try and go somewhere, you go on Google Maps, you search it up. I mean, imagine just being able to say, hey, what areas do you sort of service, and then actually know the real live wait time. And if your wait time or whatever is not accurate, you just get pulled from the list, right? That would be a pretty big penalty, but it would also be a big incentive for those that have got capacity or have actually been providing quality service, that they create a better relationship, because I think it needs to be good communication.
Yeah, definitely.
Providers to support coordinators to NDIS, everywhere across the board, communication's huge.
And even the provider list from the NDIS, I don't know if you've ever tried to generate a provider list based on the NDIS's list, but it comes up with stuff that's, in Bendigo or they're operating in Coffs Harbour or something, because I guess their list shows where a company is registered to operate. It's not necessarily where they're actually offering services. So you can end up with a list that's probably 5, 6, 7, 8 times longer than it should be. And then you've really got to spend time sort of weaning that down. It's a bit crazy, really. So that's why I guess we tend to go back for people that we trust and that we've worked with. But it's interesting, even amongst our team, we as individuals have different providers that we look to. One of my team was telling me the other day about a provider I'd never heard of before, and she said, oh, no, they're really good. So it's about that sharing of information again, isn't it?
Yeah, really important. Influential people. I'd love to know, you've probably along your journey had a few people that have been influential to you, and I'd love to know what bit of advice or what sort of learnings you might well have had from people that have helped you along your way.
Yeah. I would say there's been certainly some managers and supervisors that have been influential people over me and have really helped, especially now as a manager, helped me guide the way that I like to operate now. And my focus, I guess, on, for example, one thing my previous manager, who I loved, really instilled in me is, if you've got an issue, resolve it today. Don't leave it so it becomes bigger than Ben-Hur, and like that old adage of don't let the sun go down on your argument, isn't it? It's a bit like that. So especially if I've got to have a hard conversation with one of my staff in particular, I really try to bite the bullet and think, okay, deep breath, let's just get it over with, So that's been one kind of influence. To be honest, I mean, it sounds a little bit corny, but I think probably some of my clients have influenced me more than anything, that, having fulfillment in life doesn't have to be a huge, big, grand thing, that it can be as simple as we were talking before about what gives you meaning, and having a purpose to life, I guess. I think everybody needs to know that they have value and that they are worthwhile. I've had a little bit of work through a charity organisation I used to be involved with. I've travelled a little bit overseas as well, to places like Vietnam and Fiji and places like that, where there is a lot of poverty, and through seeing those leaders in those countries with a real sort of servanthood kind of mentality is really something I've looked up to as well. And I think, we could do with actually a little bit of that in Australia, a little bit less sort of it's all about me and, what can I gain out of this and how can I be more comfortable, rather than, how can I be a good citizen and actually contribute effectively to having a better world.
No, I think that's a great approach. It sounds a lot like stewardship leadership, which is amazing. I've been reading a lot of leadership stuff recently, and I think it's so important that we actually put the people that we work with right, very much servant. I feel like I'm a servant of everyone in the disability sector, and if we can keep helping one another out, I think it's fantastic. I get a lot of joy out of it. Yeah,
I get a lot of satisfaction. I had another client who I'm just about to part ways with, because we've sort of I've had him as a client for 2 years, and we've gone through a lot through that time. And it was really great just recently to be able to email him and say, I was thinking about the time that we've spent together and these significant things that you've achieved over that time. And like, well done you.
Yeah, love that.
Really put it back to him that these weren't necessarily things that I had achieved. These were the things that he had achieved. And we'd kind of achieved them together, really. But that just gives me a huge buzz that I've been able to help him change his own life, if that makes sense.
Well, massively, and empowerment is what I'm really hearing there.
Yeah.
Speaking about that, this could be a big one. Let's find out where we go. So I've just given you a wand. You've now got it. So you can change anything, something within the NDIS. Given this is the case, what would you do? If you change, say, one thing, what would you pick on?
Okay, well, one of the things I would do for a long time, they have talked about making the funding model much more flexible and getting rid of, core capacity building, capital, and just making it all one pool of money. I would do that, definitely, because so many clients, they have enough funding in this area, but they have nothing in this one, and you can't shuffle across, or because, someone providing services isn't registered for SIL, there's all this money sitting there, but they can't access it. Or, just to make it more practical, I guess, so it could be more flexible. And there has been talk about it for a long time, but it's just never really happened. At least I guess we have that flexibility within core, but the rest of it is very very locked in.
Yeah, no, I hear that. It sounds a lot like Sam Payo from the growing space. I was listening to a podcast, I think it was with DCS, it might have been.
DCS,
Yeah, it was on the other day, and it was very fascinating. I think that's why she's taking her approach about being very big on self-management, because of the ability to then be able to have the flexibility and move things around. I just don't know whether it's acceptable for everyone to be able to have the knowledge to be able to apply that.
No.
And so I just it's almost like handicapping people in some regard.
Yeah.
Like if you have people that know how to use that well, they then really get the benefit of it. But those that don't, it's sort of like if you don't have that information and that knowledge, you sort of then be disadvantaged. So I'm really intrigued to see whether we end up getting more of that model, or even through a plan managed approach, possibly. I don't really know how that might look.
That would be another thing that I would do, is I would make everybody plan manage from the outset. For me, having agency managed funding, and I understand why they do that for some things like for SEAL, and, because they're big amounts of money and they want to make sure that it's all above board and following, correct, approvals and registrations and all that sort of thing. But for me, if someone's core, for example, is agency managed, it's shocking. There's so many hidden layers within the agency managed funding, and it is not transparent at all. Whereas if someone is with a plan manager, and I fail to see how the NDIS could do it cheaper than what they pay plan managers to do anyway, to be quite honest, because they don't pay very much for plan management.
No.
But, you can, if you're then going through, my plan manager, or whether you're using, one of the plan managers that have the CareView app that they use, as a support coordinator, you can see straight away where the money is going, who's the providers using most of it, what areas are not being covered. It's much more transparent.
I think that's what we've been asking for a long time, as far as being really transparent, and that's what we get in those sort of systems. Whilst we're talking about being transparent, bad recommendations, do you hear of many bad recommendations, or maybe where support coordinators go wrong?
I think trying to be everything to everybody is a big way of going wrong. Trying to solve all the world's problems, without having that sort of awareness of no, that's crossed my boundary. That's not within my scope. Like we've talked before, it'd be really interesting, as you say, to see what comes out around, what is and what isn't in our scope, and get a bit more guidance around that will be really good. I think burnout within support coordinators is really, really common. People just feel like it's too much. So again, it's that, I guess, that self-care, self-monitoring stuff that goes on. And also there can be a lot of pressure, I guess, from companies and employers as well to take on more and more and more. So you end up sort of being overloaded and not being able to do anything really, because you're just too busy.
You're lacking that purpose because you're not able to actually deliver on what you need to.
Yeah, that's it. I think they're probably the main things that I'd sort of think of, but also, not perhaps diving deep enough with your clients, to sort of keep it all very, you want to keep it on a professional level, obviously, not get involved in Facebooking each other and all that sort of thing, but to be really genuine and open with your clients, I think is really important, and to be who you are, to be a genuine person and not someone who's just sort of coming in with all the answers.
Yeah, on the same level, sort of sitting across from one another rather than standing above.
Yeah, and I think certainly this period of being a support coordinator has really changed some of my attitudes towards disability, I'm sure, and I've become much more open, I guess, to disabled people having something really positive to offer in the community. And amazing to watch the Paralympics and things like that, and just sort of think, oh wow, like I get it so easy. I don't have to struggle with those kind of barriers. It's amazing.
Awesome. Dylan Alcott's been amazing watching. I think he's inspired this year. Absolutely fantastic with how he's gone about, and he's a real front runner in that regard. I really love how he approaches
and
things.
I don't know if you've noticed, just like the last probably even 12 months, I've noticed that odd things in advertisements and things, like there's an ad out at the moment. I'm not sure what company it's for, but there's a Down syndrome child in the ad.
Yeah, lovely.
I've seen ads with amputees in them. It's becoming much more recognised as a normal part of the community, which is huge.
That's a massive, massive move. Speaking of massive moves, we've got our last question coming up here. So
cool.
Let's pretend it's 20 years into the future. We've achieved success in the disability sector.
Come on, I'll be retired by then, Trevor. Come on.
No, you're still around. We'll get you around for that. So we've achieved success in the disability sector. What does it look like? What does it feel like? Paint me a picture.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to hope that it's going to feel a lot more like normal life. I think we've come a massive way over the last 50 years in the acceptance of people with disabilities. So, yeah, that would be my dream, I guess, is that it just feels like they're the person living next door. Also that there really is genuine flexibility and choice and control for people. I think sometimes it's almost like politically correct almost to talk about choice and control, but it's not necessarily a real genuine thing.
So like lip service, I'm sort of hearing, is that right?
Yeah, a little bit of lip service. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And especially, for those really challenging people that are living regionally or in really, minority groups within the disability sector that just don't feel as though they have a voice, it would be really amazing if those people could feel like they actually are heard and genuinely listened to. That would be amazing. Where, you hopefully don't have to fight for every cent. Yes, you're always going to have to provide evidence and justification, but it shouldn't have to be World War III, to be able to get actual access to services that really genuinely meet your needs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm quite intrigued to hear what Linda Reynolds has got, the MP, in regards to the NDIS. I wonder what her take is, and I wonder how we're planning on getting there, because I think we all really want to know how this is growing and developing. It's still in its early stages at the moment, really. Where it ends up landing will be interesting to know.
Yeah, and I think, if you think back to where we were 10 years ago, I think we would be surprised to see what has actually happened in that last 10 years. I think you can't be Doctor Who and time travel back, but if you could, I think it would be really interesting. I think there's been massive, massive changes in that time. So it's almost like, dream big for the next 10 or 20 years and then see if we can actually make it happen.
Well, that's the only way we're going to get there, isn't it?
Yeah.
Got to start with a vision, don't we?
Yeah, you do.
We've been talking to Heather Jesshope, an occupational therapist turned into a specialist support coordinator, proudly leading the team of support coordinators at Assured Home Care. Heather, where can we go to learn more about what it is that you do?
So you can go to the Assured Home Care website. That'd be a good start. But also there's a lot of information about support coordination within the NDIS website itself. Feel free to give me a call as well. And especially if you're interested in employment with us down the future, we're good for now, but we're always looking for new staff and people who really have a passion for the field of disability. I think we need to support each other a bit more, perhaps in this field as well. So, if you'd just like to have a coffee and a chat, I'm up for that as well.
Oh, fantastic. Well, thank you so much today for being so honest and authentic. It was really a pleasure.
Thank you so much.